Let's paint up the Stormcast Eternal character models to a higher standard today.
That the entirety of the cosmos is accessible through each and every individual's mind, connecting to the great mind, the great spirit.
Welcome back to the Studio Collectors. AOS Dominion has been quite a ride for me and my team. We've been frantically painting and producing videos so that you can get your own set of Dominion painted up quickly and beautifully. The focus for today's video would be sharing some tips and tricks of how you can get the character models painted up to a slightly higher standard and make them really eye-catching on the tabletop while being very beautiful and admired up close. So let's face it, Dominion comes with so many models, and in order to paint them all eye-catching, there's no way. Nobody has that amount of time to get all the models painted up to a high display standard. The fact is that the battle line units will mostly be admired from quite a distance when you're playing the game, and the character models, because they might be the general of your army, they will be admired from a lot closer. That being said, there are already many useful tips in the previous video where Scary Mini Painter and myself have painted the 10 Vindicators from the Dominion box set. But in these videos, I'll be sharing even more tips and tricks so that you can get the Annihilators painted up to an even higher standard. This will allow your character models to really stand out of the crowd and be admired up close. So as usual, I've cut this video into useful and easy to watch chapters, and these are the chapters for this video. Tips and tricks. Contrast, non-metallic metal gold, non-metallic metal silver, details, and the environmental effects. So if you're here just for the painting portions, why don't you just skip on ahead before I move on to my tips and tricks. So before I begin painting the miniature, here are some tips and tricks that you might want to employ while painting up your character models. The first tip that I would like to share with you guys is to use contrast paint, because this really achieves a very wonderful effect while it's being done over zenithal highlighting. This allows the volumes to be accurately placed, as well as, because the contrast paint is used as a fat heavy glaze, it allows little details that you might not have spotted on the model to be identified. But this is fair warning, don't do it the way that GW recommends you to just slather the paint on, because that's a surefire way to fail your characters and have the details being clogged up. What you should be doing, apply the contrast with some degree of care and always wick off the extra. Now this brings me to my second tip for painting character models beautifully and quickly. Don't blend your models just yet. Wait, what's this I hear? Character models with no blending? Are you sure? That's right. When I painted the Annihilator model, I chose not to do any blending because I wanted to show the textures and the striations on the metallic surfaces. This can be done if you're consciously thinking about the types of textures that you want to portray on your miniatures. And because you've done so consciously, this allows a higher degree of realism when painting surfaces on your miniatures. And this brings me to my last tip for this video, is to use contrast as a glaze. Wait, 2 contrast tips in one video? What's this? By using contrast as a glaze, I mean you should thin down the contrast to 1 part contrast and 3 parts contrast medium. And this allows you to smooth down the transition for the blendless surfaces that you have done. Lastly, because contrast is used as a glaze, it also smoothens out the little imperfections that your brushstroke might have left on the model, giving it a very smooth and flawless finish. Now with the tips and tricks out of the way, we're going to start on with our first painting chapter, which is the contrast stage. For this chapter, I've already assembled the models and zenithal primed them with a white primer over a black surface. I find that adding contrast over a zenithal primed surface allows the contrast to have a very deep shadow while having very vibrant midtones and highlights. For this stage, I don't recommend thinning down any of the contrast paints so that we can have maximum saturation on these surfaces. Lastly, remember, overload your model carefully, then wick off the excess using a drier brush. This will reduce the amount of tight marks on your model and give you a wonderful, flawless result. For this stage, I'll be recommending these contrast colors right here. And let's get these contrast colors ready, and let's get this contrast stage on the road right now. Alright, so for the first step, we're going to be using Contrast Nazrak Yellow. So right here you can see, just want to liberally apply this fat glaze all over the gold parts, but careful, don't want to have this cover any of the areas that you don't want the gold to be. So you just gotta make sure that you do this in one smooth layer and not cover anywhere that you don't want the gold to be. Okay? So I'm just going to finish this up and I'm going to be coating the blue areas. For the blue areas, I'm going to be using GW Ultramarines Blue. So I'm going to be doing this for his lapel pin thing on his left hand side as well as his shoulders. Alright, so for the next thing, I'm going to be coating the rest of the silver and the stone areas using Basilicarum Grey. At this point in time, you just want to make sure you liberally coat it so that you can get the contrast effect without having the tight marks. So now that the base colors have been completed using the contrast, that's the heavy lifting done, and we can focus on how to make this yellow surface look more like non-metallic metal gold. For this stage, I want you to remember just one point, which is always remember the shape of the armor. Place these shapes consciously and make sure that these shapes communicate to your audience how the form of the miniature should be. If you're not too sure what shapes of highlights to be placed on, you can always place your miniature under a light to see where the highlights lie. However, to explain this concept even deeper, that's a whole nother video for another time. For this stage, I'll be using these AK Generation 3 colors right here. These AK Generation 3 colors have been selected because I only need these few colors, and alternatively, these Games Workshop colors will work just fine for this stage. So let's get these colors ready and let's get painting the non-metallic metal gold on the Annihilators right now. Alright, so now right here we have the fully contrasted Annihilator, and I'm going to be using a little bit of AK Gen 3 Pale Yellow plus a little bit of AK Gen 3 Ochre. This will allow me to start placing in the highlights, and at this point of time I want you to focus on the shapes of the highlights. So moving on, gradually I'm adding in a little bit more pale yellow just to increase the value, and at this point of time I want to make sure that I'm painting within the shape that I've created just now and just leaving a little bit of the previous layer. At this point of time, I'm also focusing a lot more towards the edges so that I can start to define the hard and sharp edges of this non-metallic metal. That is the hallmark of a good non-metallic metal surface. So moving on, I'm adding in a little bit of greenish white, and this greenish white I'm focusing more towards the right hand side because I want the highlights on the right hand side to be a little bit cooler, and I'm going to be using straight on pale yellow for the left hand side of the model, which is going to be slightly warmer. And right now I'm going with an overall sort of wash glaze consistency of Brickland Flash Shade. I find that this allows me to really define the areas well. And this allows all the details to really pop up. Lastly, I'm going to be using a little bit of Gulliman Flash, and I'm just using this as a glaze straight out of the pot, and I'm going to be using this to sort of like blend down some of the transitions so that they are not as harsh. Just taking a leaf from Scary Mini Painter. So right here I'm going to be adding in a little bit of Gunship Green mixed in with a little bit of deep brown from AK Gen 3. This is going to be for the reflected lights coming out from the swamp. I'm doing this near the bottom of the model, and I'm doing this a lot more prominently there to showcase the greenish tint of the reflected light. So I'm just adding in a little bit of medium orange into the previous mix just to warm up the reflected lights and to add some complexity to the reflected lights that I've just added previously. Now that the non-metallic metal gold surfaces on the Annihilators have been painted, let's focus on the silver. For the silver, I'm going to add in a little twist. I'm going to be adding in a little bit of pink so that this silver really stands out from the rest of the silvers that we have already painted. For these chapters, I recommend these AK Generation 3 colors to be used. Alternatively, you can always substitute it with these Games Workshop colors right here. So let's get all these colors ready and let's paint up the silver non-metallic metal areas on this Stormcast Eternal right now. Alright, so we are going to move on to the non-metallic metal silver. So right here I'm going to be using a bit of brown rose mixed in with a little bit of medium grey. Wait a minute, isn't this a little strange? Why am I using pink for this stage? I find that adding a little bit of pink in this stage will make the silver look a little bit more complex, and I will be showcasing this technique a lot more when I paint Intrastar. You can see all these underpainting techniques, and I deliberately made the pink a little bit more desaturated so that this allows the pink to not look so obviously as pink. So I'm adding in a little bit of pastel green here to sort of balance the color temperatures. And to place in the extreme highlights for the non-metallic metal silver. And for the highlight, I'm adding in greenish white, and you can see this greenish white really nicely contrasts against the pink tones that we added in previously to create a very complex NMM look. Now that the gold and silver have been painted on the Stormcast Eternal Annihilator, we're going to focus on small little details such as the lightning coming out from the shield, as well as other small details. For this stage, we'll be carefully picking out these details using these colors right here from AK Generation 3. Alternatively, these Games Workshop colors can be used. So let's get these colors ready and let's get painting the details on the Stormcast Annihilators right now. So I'm going to be doing the meteor glow that's coming on for the Stormcast Eternal Annihilators. So right here I'm using blue-green in a wash consistency. I've thinned this down a lot and I'm just gradually washing this all around the areas where I want the glows to be. So this is done so that I can suggest that this ring around the gold armor in the middle is glowing. Next up, I'm going to be using snow blue in a wash, and I'm going to wash this down into the cracks. So this suggests that in between the cracks, light is showing through. And lastly, I'm going to be using a little bit of Russian green here, just to really pick out the shadows and blackline the areas. So now that most of the Stormcast Eternal Annihilator has been done, we're going to tie this entire model down using the environmental effects. We'll be focusing on how to make this miniature look good in photos, as well as close up when people pick up your character models and admire them from a shorter distance. This will require incorporating external elements such as the sunset colors from the sunset battle, as well as the reflections from the swampy bog. For this stage, I'll be using these colors from AK Generation 3. Alternatively, you can use these Games Workshop colors to replace them if you don't have them. Alright, so let's get these colors ready and let's get painting the environmental effect on the Stormcast Eternal Annihilator right now. Alright, so right here we're going to try to create a sunset look on this Stormcast Eternal Annihilator. First step, I'm going to be using Dark Oath Flash, and I'm just glazing down the right hand shoulder of the Annihilator to create the base tones. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be using AK Gen 3 Light Rust to place in the initial highlights for the sunset. So at this point of time, you want to make sure that the AK Gen 3 Light Rust is really thinned down so that you don't create too harsh a marks, and place these highlights in the shapes that you have done so previously. Okay, so lastly I'm going to be using AK Gen 3 light orange, and this will be the final highlights. At this point in time, we want to be picking out the little details and doing some edge highlightings to make all the details look really sharp and beautiful. Okay, right now I'm going to be using dark green gray, and I'm going to use this color to start to pick out some of the details on the underside of the model. This is to emphasize the green glow that's coming from the swamp. So in conclusion, in order to get your character models done well, you want to get the base stages done as quickly as possible. For me, I opted to use contrast, but if you want to use an airbrush, that's fine too. Because getting the base stages done quick, you have more time to spend on the special effects such as the non-metallic metal, as well as the environmental effects that you can incorporate onto all your character models. And there we have it. So let's look at the Stormcast Eternal Annihilator right now. Alright, this is the final result of the Stormcast Eternal Annihilator. I really like how the sunset glow contrasts against the green glow coming from the swamp, and this lends a very beautiful temperature gradient for all your character models out there. Thank you all for watching all the way to the end. So if you think that I deserve it, why not give me a like and subscribe, because it helps the channel and it allows me to keep producing videos such as this. Want to support the channel even further? Head on to Patreon and become a patron. Get a whole slew of painting content which we have been producing for the past year or so. Thank you all for watching once again, and we'll see you in the next Dominion painting video. See you!